My husband Richard orchestrated a violent break-in at our own home last night, just to terrifying me into providing him with fresh emotional material for his failing novel. And he stood in the shadows, taking notes, while a stranger held a knife to my throat. Now, as the morning sun floods our pristine kitchen, he saunters into the room with a smug, satisfied grin on his face, believing that my trembling hands and absolute silence are signs that I have finally been broken into total submission. I am standing by the marble island, methodically rolling out dough and stirring the thick, dark filling for a blackberry pie, performing the domestic duties of a devoted wife while the scent of butter and repressed rage fills the air. He laughs softly, pouring himself coffee, completely unaware that the guests I have secretly invited are about to arrive. And they are not coming for a social call. When the doorbell finally rings, shattering the oppressive quiet of this house, his arrogant smile will curdle into sheer terror as he realizes that my silence was never a surrender, but a carefully constructed death sentence for his career. You know that specific, heavy silence that settles over a house after a funeral, where the air feels too thick to breathe and every small sound, like the ticking of a clock or the hum of a refrigerator, sounds like a gunshot in a canyon. That is exactly what my life has felt like for the past 5 years, living inside this architectural masterpiece of glass and steel, serving as the muse for America's favorite crime novelist. Imagine walking on eggshells, but the eggshells are actually razor blades, and you have to smile while your feet bleed because the man watching you needs your pain to pay the mortgage on his Hamptons estate. I used to think that love was about sacrifice, about giving pieces of yourself to make the other person whole. So I gave him my traumatic past, my nightmares, and my deepest insecurities, allowing him to weave them into bestsellers that the New York Times praised as visceral and hauntingly authentic. But as I stand here this morning, pressing the tines of a silver fork into the crust of this pie, I realize that I didn't just sacrifice my privacy. I sacrificed my dignity to a man who looks at my tears and sees only dollar signs and literary awards. The flashbacks hit me in jagged, disorienting waves, forcing my mind back to the terrifying events of 12 hours ago, when the sound of shattering glass in the foyer jolted me from a restless sleep. I remember the heavy, suffocating weight of a gloved hand clamping over my mouth, the cold, biting sting of a serrated blade pressing against the soft skin of my neck, and the smell of stale tobacco and cheap cologne radiating from the intruder. I was paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, my eyes darting frantically into the darkness, searching for my husband, my protector, the man who promised to keep me safe. And then I saw him, standing just outside the beam of the moonlight, not reaching for the phone to call 911, not rushing forward with a baseball bat, but standing perfectly still with his notebook open, his pen scratching furiously against the paper as he observed my terror with the clinical detachment of a scientist dissecting a frog. He wasn't helpless. He was hungry, feeding on the raw, unfiltered panic that he had paid someone to induce. And in that moment, the loving husband died, and only the monster remained. Now, Richard leans against the counter, his silk robe rustling softly, and reaches out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin with a possessiveness that makes my stomach churn with bile. He looks at the bruises blooming on my wrist, the purple marks left by the intruder's grip, and instead of shame or concern, his eyes gleam with a twisted sort of pride, as if those injuries are accolades he earned. "You were magnificent last night, Elena," he whispers, his voice smooth and rich like expensive bourbon. "The way you screamed, the way you pleaded for your life. It was exactly the breakthrough I needed for the final chapter." He thinks this pie, this blackberry pie that he usually hates because it reminds him of the cheap diners we used to eat at before he became famous, is a peace offering. A sign that I am trying to comfort myself with nostalgia. He has no idea that blackberry pie is actually the only thing I remember eating the day my parents died. And I only make it when I am preparing to say goodbye to someone forever. I focus on the rhythmic motion of crimping the edges of the crust, channeling every ounce of my hatred into the dough, refusing to let my hands shake, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble again. He takes a sip of his coffee, sighing contentedly, and starts talking about his upcoming book tour, about how this new manuscript will secure his legacy, about how we should plan a trip to Italy with the advance money. It is fascinating, in a morbid way, to watch a man build castles in the air while standing directly on a trapdoor, completely oblivious to the fact that the lever is about to be pulled. I turn to the oven, the heat blasting against my face, and I slide the pie onto the rack, thinking about how fire can either destroy or purify. And today, I am choosing purification. Is everything all right? Darling, he asks, detecting a slight shift in the atmosphere, perhaps sensing the static electricity of my resolve. You're awfully quiet this morning, even for you. I'm just thinking about the ending. Richard, I say, my voice surprising me with its steadiness, low and clear, lacking the tremor that has defined my speech for years. He chuckles, setting his mug down on the granite coaster, and waves his hand dismissively. Don't worry your pretty little head about that. I've got the ending all figured out, and it's going to be tragic, beautiful, and absolutely inevitable. The irony of his words hangs in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, because he is right. The ending will be inevitable, but the tragedy will not belong to the character named Elena in his book. I wipe my hands on a dish towel, deliberately leaving a smear of flour on the dark fabric, a mark of my labor, and I glance at the digital clock on the microwave, watching the seconds tick down 859. 900. Right on cue. The silence of our fortress is pierced by the sharp, authoritative chime of the doorbell, a sound that usually signals a delivery or a maid, but today signals the end of his reign. Richard frowns, his eyebrows knitting together in annoyance, the interruption cracking the perfect veneer of his triumphant morning. Who on earth could that be at this hour? He snaps, tightening the belt of his robe, clearly irritated that the world is intruding on his artistic afterglow. He looks at me, expecting me to rush to the door as I always do, expecting me to shield him from the mundane inconveniences of life. But I remain rooted to the spot, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. I didn't order anything, he mutters, more to himself than to me, starting to walk toward the hallway with an impatient huff. Probably just some solicitor or a fan who found the address. I'll get rid of them. He has no idea that the fan waiting on our doorstep is Detective Vance, a man who has spent 20 years chasing monsters, and who is currently holding a copy of the police report I filed electronically from the bathroom at 4:00 a.m. I follow him, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor, moving like a ghost in my own home, watching his back, watching the confident swagger that has always intimidated me. He reaches the heavy oak door, unlocks it with a sharp click, and swings it open with an aggressive flourish, ready to bark at whoever dared to disturb him. "Can I help you?" he demands, his voice dripping with condescension. But the words die in his throat as he takes in the sight before him. Detective Vance stands there, grim and imposing in his trench coat. Flanking him is Clara, the editor-in-chief of the publishing house, clutching a manila envelope with white-knuckled intensity. The color drains from Richard's face, leaving him gray and ashen, his eyes widening in shock as he looks from the badge on Vance's belt to the accusation in Clara's eyes. And finally, He turns to look at me, realizing for the first time that the prey has led the hunters straight to his den. The rough texture of the Persian rug is pressing against my cheek, and the first thing I register is not pain, but the rhythmic, suffocating sound of Richard's voice drifting from the hallway. Casual and transactional, as if he is ordering a pizza rather than discussing the assault of his wife. I keep my eyes squeezed shut, regulating my breathing to shallow, invisible sips of air, because my body is still paralyzed by the phantom memory of cold steel against my throat. And I know that if I move, if I make a sound, the performance will continue. She went down harder than I expected, Richard says, and I can hear the clink of ice against crystal, the distinct sound of him pouring a celebratory scotch. But the terror in her eyes, God, it was visceral, exactly the raw material I needed for the climax. My stomach twists, a violent knot of nausea tightening beneath my ribs, because the man I have shared a bed with for 5 years is not calling an ambulance. He is not pacing the floor in worry. He is debriefing a hired thug about the quality of my trauma. The realization hits me like a physical blow, shattering the last fragile remnants of my denial. And I lay there in the dark, listening to the man I loved haggle over the price of my sanity, negotiating a bonus for the actor because he managed to bruise my neck without breaking the skin. I wait until the heavy oak door of his study clicks shut, sealing him inside with his twisted genius. And then I peel myself off the floor, my limbs heavy and trembling, moving with the jagged, unnatural coordination of a marionette whose strings have been cut. I do not go to the bedroom. I do not seek comfort in the soft, down pillows where we used to whisper promises. Instead, I stumble into the guest bathroom, locking the door with a quiet, desperate click that feels like the first act of defiance. The fluorescent light flickers on, buzzing like a dying insect, and I stare at the woman in the mirror, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes wide pools of hollow darkness, and the purple bruise blossoming on her neck like a morbid corsage. I turn the faucet on, not to warm, but to freezing cold, letting the icy water numb my hands, shocking my system into a state of hyper-awareness, washing away the sweat of fear and replacing it with the cold, hard clarity of survival. I splash the water onto my face, gasping as the chill bites into my skin, and I make a silent vow to the reflection in the glass, promising her that I will not shed a single tear tonight, because tears are currency in this house, and I am done paying him. Leaving the sanctuary of the bathroom, I move like a ghost through the hallway, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood, and I stop in front of the digital photo frame on the mantel, its screen glowing softly in the gloom. The image shifts, dissolving from a landscape to a picture of us, taken 3 years ago in Maui, where Richard is holding me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder, his smile radiating a warmth that I once mistook for protection. I reach out, my finger hovering over the glass, tracing the line of his jaw, and a memory washes over me, not of violence, but of the insidious, creeping kindness that he used to groom me into the perfect victim. I remember the library where we met, the smell of old paper and vanilla, how he found me crying in the stacks over a book about trauma, and how he offered me his handkerchief, telling me that pain was just a story waiting to be rewritten. I will be your shield. Elena, he had whispered, his voice a soothing balm that lulled me into a false sense of security. I will use my pen to slay your dragons, and together we will turn your scars into armor. I believed him. God help me. I believed that he was mining my past to heal me, never realizing that he was just a prospector, and I was nothing more than a vein of gold to be stripped, hollowed out, and discarded when the yield ran dry. The house is silent now, save for the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator, And a new, dangerous thought takes root in my mind, growing rapidly from a seed of doubt into a towering tree of certainty. If he planned this, if tonight was a scripted scene, then there must be a script, a contract, a paper trail that proves he is not an artist, but a monster who orchestrates reality to fit his fiction. I creep toward his study, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I press my ear to the wood, listening for the sound of his typing. But there is only the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who sleeps the sleep of the righteous. He is so arrogant, so assured of his dominance, that he hasn't even bothered to lock the door, believing that his wife is too broken, too medicated, and too terrified to ever cross the threshold of his creative sanctuary. I turn the brass knob, the metal cold and slippery in my sweating palm, and push the door open, stepping into the room that smells of leather, expensive whiskey, and the stale, lingering scent of his betrayal. The computer screen is asleep, a dark mirror reflecting my silhouette, and I approach it with a sense of dread, knowing that what I am about to find will destroy the version of my life that I have clung to for so long. I wake the computer, the blue light flooding the room, illuminating the stacks of notes and the half-empty bottle of scotch on the desk, and I type in the password, which is, sickeningly, the date of our wedding. The email client is open, and there it is, right at the top of the inbox, a thread with a subject line that makes my blood run cold. Invoice for services, rendered, night of the 14th. My hands shake so violently that I can barely maneuver the mouse. But I force myself to click, to open the attachment, and I read the terms of the agreement. The specific instructions to maximize panic, the directive to use a serrated knife for texture, and the bonus clause for inducing a faint. Beside the keyboard lies his notebook, open to a fresh page, and I see his handwriting, sharp and angular, describing my reaction not with empathy, but with clinical glee. Subject's pupils dilated, breath shallow, complete psychological collapse achieved. He didn't just watch me suffer. He directed it, he curated it, and he is planning to sell it to the world as fiction, stealing my voice and selling it back to me, bound in hardcover. The first rays of dawn are beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, gray shadows across the room. And I know that I have very little time before the master of the house wakes up to inspect his property. I do not scream. I do not smash the computer. Instead, I reach into the pocket of my robe and pull out a USB drive. A small, silver object that feels heavy with the weight of my future. I plug it in, my movements precise and mechanical, and I begin to copy everything. The emails, the bank transfers, the draft chapters where he plagiarized my therapy journals, watching the progress bar fill up like an hourglass, counting down the remaining minutes of his career. As the transfer completes, I feel a shift within me, a subtle but irreversible clicking of gears, as the trembling victim evaporates, replaced by a cold, calculating witness who understands that justice is not given. It is taken. I pull the drive out, clutching it in my fist like a weapon, and I look at the sleeping form of the manuscript on the screen one last time, whispering into the silence of the room. You wanted a plot twist, Richard, so I am going to give you one. Standing in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of Richard's study, holding the USB drive that contains the digital autopsy of our marriage, I find myself pulled back into the suffocating gravity of the past, back to the days when the monster was still just a desperate man drowning in his own mediocrity. Before the awards, before the 7-figure book deals, and before this mausoleum of a house, Richard was a pathetic figure who smelled perpetually of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bourbon, A man whose ego was slowly being eroded by a relentless tide of rejection letters from every publishing house in New York. I remember the sound of him pacing the floorboards of our cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, the rhythm of his frustration vibrating through the thin walls. And I remember how I used to ache for him, how I used to brew him tea and massage his tense shoulders, believing that his genius was simply misunderstood by a commercial world. He wasn't cruel then, or at least he hadn't found the confidence to be cruel. He was simply hollow, a vast, empty vessel waiting to be filled. And I was the naive fool who poured herself into him until there was nothing left of me but a shell. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, insidious alchemy that began the day he found my red leather therapy journal, the one where my psychiatrist had encouraged me to vomit out the poisonous memories of my abduction, the darkness I had kept locked away since I was 16. I had left it on the nightstand, a careless mistake born of trust. And I returned home from my shift at the library to find him sitting at the kitchen table, reading my deepest traumas with the same hungry, predatory intensity that a wolf looks at a wounded deer. He didn't apologize for invading my privacy. He didn't offer comfort for the horrors I had written down. Instead, he looked up at me with eyes that were shining with a terrifying new light, a feverish inspiration that I mistook for empathy. "This is it, Elena," he had whispered, tapping the page where I described the smell of damp earth and the sound of my captor's heavy breathing. "This is the raw, visceral truth that I've been missing. This is what people want to read." That night, he wrote for 10 hours straight, his fingers flying across the keyboard, cannibalizing my pain, restructuring my nightmares into a narrative arc. And for the first time in years, he looked happy. And because I loved him, I let him steal my soul. When The Girl in the Cellar was published, the world applauded his haunting imagination and his unflinching look at the human psyche, while I stood in the background at his launch parties, holding his coat, smiling tightly as critics praised him for articulating a pain he had never felt. The money started pouring in, a river of cash that should have brought us freedom. But instead, it became another chain, because Richard began to view our bank account as a scorecard of his brilliance, and me as a resource that needed to be managed, harvested, and controlled. He bought this house, this glass cage, without asking me, claiming it was for my safety. But I knew it was because the isolated location made me entirely dependent on him. Cutting me off from the few friends I had left, he took control of the finances, giving me an allowance like a child, criticizing my spending on groceries while he bought vintage typewriters and imported scotch, subtly reinforcing the idea that he was the provider, the genius, the king. And I was just the silent muse who should be grateful for his protection. I remember the day he bought me a diamond necklace with the royalties from the sequel, fastening it around my neck with cold fingers, and I felt the weight of it like a collar, a glittering reminder that I was owned, that every carat was purchased with a piece of my dignity. The violence, when it finally arrived, didn't start with a fist. It started with a shattered glass and a demand for authenticity that stripped away the last layer of my defenses. He was struggling with the third book. The critics were waiting. And he needed more. He needed to know exactly what it felt like when my captor had threatened to kill me. He wanted the sensory details of my near-death experience. We were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, and he was interrogating me, his voice rising in frustration as I wept and refused to relive the moment, refused to give him the specific texture of my terror. "You are being so selfish." "Elena!" he roared, his face contorted in a mask of ugly entitlement, and he hurled his heavy crystal tumbler against the fireplace, the sound of the explosion echoing like a gunshot in the large room. Shards of glass flew everywhere. one slicing a thin line across my cheek. And for a moment, there was absolute silence. A vacuum where the air used to be. He didn't rush to see if I was hurt. He didn't apologize. He just looked at the blood trickling down my face and said, with chilling calmness, "See, that's the emotion I need. Why can't you just give me that on the page?" That was the moment the man I loved died, and the parasite took full control. Realizing that if I wouldn't give him the pain voluntarily, he could extract it from me through fear, intimidation, and eventually, orchestrated trauma. I stand in his study now, the morning light fully illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and I look at the row of his bestsellers on the shelf, seeing them not as books, but as tombstones marking the death of my agency. I have been his ghostwriter, his victim, and his ATM. I have allowed my silence to fertilize his career, growing a garden of poisonous flowers that he sells to the world as art. But the realization is no longer heavy. It is liberating. A sharp, metallic taste in my mouth that signals the end of my complicity. I slide the USB drive into the pocket of my silk robe, feeling its hard edges against my hip. A hidden dagger that will cut the cords binding me to this farce. I turn my back on his desk, on the shrine to his stolen genius, and I walk out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Just as he left the door to his morality open years ago, I descend the floating staircase to the kitchen, the heart of the house where I have spent thousands of hours cooking meals he barely tasted. And I begin the ritual that will set the stage for his final performance. The kitchen is vast and cold, a showroom of stainless steel and marble that was designed to impress guests rather than to nourish a family. But today, I will fill it with the warmth of a Judgment Day breakfast. I open the cabinet where the fine bone china is kept, the plates that are so delicate they are almost translucent, the ones we are only supposed to use for distinguished guests. And I set the table for three myself, the prosecutor and the executioner. My movements are precise, almost balletic. As I retrieve the heavy bag of flour from the pantry, the white dust puffing into the air like a cloud of smoke, settling on the dark granite countertop, I reach for the basket of blackberries I bought yesterday. Their dark, glistening skins reminding me of clotted blood, and the smell of them, sweet and slightly fermented, hits me with the force of a physical blow. Blackberry pie. It is an innocent enough dessert to the rest of the world, a staple of summer picnics and family gatherings. But in this house, it is a loaded weapon, a specific trigger that Richard has avoided for years because he knows the story behind it. It was the smell that permeated the cellar where I was kept, the scent of the wild bushes that grew over the ventilation shaft, the only connection I had to the outside world while I waited to die. Richard knows this. He knows that the smell of baking blackberries usually sends me into a catatonic state of panic, which is why he will be so confused, so disarmed. When he walks in and smells it wafting from the oven, I dump the berries into the mixing bowl, crushing them with a wooden spoon, watching the dark juice stain the wood, and I feel a surge of dark satisfaction. I am reclaiming the scent. I am taking the weapon out of his hands and turning it against him, using his own knowledge of my trauma to unsettle him. He thinks he knows the plot. He thinks he understands the character of his wife. But he has forgotten the cardinal rule of writing: a character pushed to their absolute limit will always evolve. I crack the eggs into the flour, the sound sharp and definitive, and I begin to knead the dough, pushing my knuckles into the soft, yielding mixture, channeling all the rage of the past 5 years into the physical action. I think of the nights he forced me to sleep with the lights on because shadows look better in the morning light. I think of the bank accounts I can't access, the friends I've lost touch with, the woman I used to be before I became a footnote in his biography. The dough is tough, resistant, but I am stronger. my hands working with a rhythm that is ancient and undeniable. The rhythm of a woman preparing a funeral feast. I hear the floorboards creak upstairs. The heavy, lumbering steps of the beast, waking from his slumber, stretching his limbs, unaware that the ground beneath him has already crumbled. I place the pie in the oven, setting the timer with a beep that sounds like the arming of a bomb. And I lean back against the counter, waiting for the scent to rise, waiting for the heat to build, waiting for the final act to begin. The nightmare didn't begin with a scream. It began with the shattering of the French doors downstairs. A violent, jagged sound that ripped through the silence of the house like a gunshot, instantly pulling me from the deep, chemical sleep of my medication into a waking hell. I lay frozen in the master bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the hum of the air conditioning. And for a terrifying second, I prayed that it was just the wind, just a branch hitting the glass. But then came the heavy, deliberate crunch of boots on the hardwood floor, the distinct sound of an intruder moving with purpose through the sanctuary of my home, violating the safety that Richard had promised this fortress of steel and stone would provide. I turned to the other side of the bed, my hand groping in the darkness for Richard's shoulder, needing him to wake up, to grab the baseball bat he kept in the closet, to be the protector he claimed to be. But the sheets were cold and empty, smooth as a frozen lake, and I realized, with a jolt of pure panic, that I was alone. The footsteps were getting closer, thudding up the floating staircase with a rhythmic, predatory cadence, and I scrambled backward, pressing my spine against the headboard, my breath hitching in my throat as the doorknob slowly, agonizingly, began to turn. The door swung open with a creak that sounded like a scream in the darkness, and a silhouette filled the frame. A hulking, shapeless shadow that seemed to suck the light out of the room, bringing with it the smell of the outside world, of damp earth and something acrid like stale tobacco. I tried to scream, to unleash the terror building in my chest, but my voice was paralyzed, trapped behind a wall of fear so primal that it reduced me to a trembling animal. My eyes adjusting to the gloom just enough to see the glint of metal in his hand. He moved toward the bed not with the frantic energy of a thief, but with the calm, measured stride of an executioner. And before I could scramble off the mattress, he was upon me, his weight pinning my legs, his heavy leather-gloved hand clamping over my mouth to stifle the cry that was finally clawing its way up my throat. I could smell him now, a pungent mix of cheap cologne and nervous sweat, a scent that was too real, too gritty for this sanitized house. And I stared up into the ski mask that hid his face, tears streaming hot and fast down my temples, soaking into the pillowcase as I begged with my eyes for mercy. "Don't move, and maybe you won't get hurt," he hissed, his voice rough and gravelly. A cliché line from a bad movie that somehow made the reality of the knife pressing against the soft skin of my neck even more terrifying. The blade was cold, serrated, and I could feel the individual teeth of the metal biting into my flesh, a sensation so sharp and specific that it sent a shockwave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I stopped struggling, my body going limp in a gesture of absolute surrender, my mind racing through the possibilities of death, wondering if it would be quick, if Richard would come home to find my body, if he would mourn me, or if he would just write another book about the tragedy of losing his muse. The intruder leaned closer, his breath hot on my face, and he shifted the knife slightly, just enough to scratch the skin. A tiny, stinging pain that signaled the beginning of the end, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the final slide of the blade, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. "Richard," I finally managed to scream against the leather of the glove, the name tearing from my throat as the hand shifted slightly. a desperate, pathetic plea for the husband who had sworn to keep the world from hurting me. I expected to hear the sound of a struggle, the rush of footsteps, the chaotic noise of a rescue. But instead, there was a click, the sudden, blinding flare of a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the scene with a stark, clinical brilliance. I squinted against the glare, my heart leaping with a surge of hope, thinking that Richard had arrived with a weapon, that the light was to blind the attacker, that I was saved. But the intruder didn't recoil. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He simply held his position, keeping the knife steady against my jugular. And he turned his head slightly toward the light. Not in fear, but in deferential acknowledgement. My eyes adjusted, blinking rapidly. And as the figure behind the light came into focus, my relief curdled into a horror far deeper, far colder than the fear of death itself. Richard was standing in the doorway, fully dressed in his charcoal writing cardigan and slacks, holding not a gun, not a phone, but his leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen, his face illuminated by the backlight of the hallway. He wasn't looking at me with concern. He wasn't looking at the intruder with rage. He was looking at the angle of the knife, the way my hair was splayed across the pillow, the specific shade of terror in my eyes, with the detached, analytical gaze of a director reviewing a blocking rehearsal. "Hold it there," Richard said, his voice calm and authoritative, speaking to the man holding a knife to his wife's throat as if he were giving notes to an actor on a stage. "The angle is wrong. Tilt her chin up more. I need to see the exposure of the neck. I need to see the vulnerability of the jugular vein." The intruder nodded, obeying the command, and roughly jerked my chin upward, exposing my throat completely. And I let out a choked sob, my brain unable to process the betrayal, unable to comprehend that the monster wasn't the man in the mask, but the man taking notes. "Richard, please," I whimpered, the words fracturing. "Please. Help me. He's going to kill me." But he didn't even make eye contact. He just stepped closer, the scratch of his pen on the paper sounding louder than my heartbeat in the silent room. "Describe the fear." "Elena," he murmured, almost to himself, stepping into the room and circling the bed like a shark. "Is it cold? Do you feel the adrenaline in your fingertips or your stomach? Is the knife sharp or dull against the skin?" He was interviewing me. He was harvesting the sensory details of my potential murder in real time, using this staged nightmare to break through his writer's block. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no danger. There was no random attack. There was only Richard and his insatiable, vampiric need for content. The intruder was an employee, a prop, and I was the raw material. The lab rat being shocked in amaze to see how high I would jump. My body, overwhelmed by the conflicting signals of mortal danger and psychological devastation, began to shut down, the adrenaline that had been sustaining me suddenly draining away, leaving behind a terrifying void. My vision began to blur at the edges, tunneling down to the point of the pen moving across the creamy paper, and my breath came in short, jagged gasps that I couldn't control, my lungs refusing to inflate. "She's going into shock." "Mr. Sterling," the intruder said, his voice changing, losing the gravelly affectation and becoming the worried, normal voice of a man who realized the game had gone too far. "She's turning blue. Man, I think we should stop," he added, easing the pressure of the knife, his hand trembling slightly as he looked from me to Richard, clearly disturbed by the callousness he was witnessing. I felt the darkness encroaching, the room spinning, the floor tilting, and I slumped sideways, the fight draining out of me, wishing that the darkness would take me completely so I wouldn't have to see the look on my husband's face. Richard sighed, a sound of profound irritation, as if I had ruined a perfect take by sneezing. And he snapped the notebook shut with a sharp clap that echoed in the room. "Don't be dramatic. Elena," he scoffed, walking over to the bedside table to turn on the lamp, flooding the room with warm, yellow light that made the scene look grotesque and surreal. "She's fine. She always does this. It's a defense mechanism to avoid confronting the emotion," he told the intruder, dismissing my physiological collapse as a character flaw. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the duvet next to my face. "Here's the rest of the fee, plus the bonus for the entry. Now get out." The mood is ruined. The intruder stood up, ripping off the ski mask to reveal the sweaty, confused face of a young man, maybe an aspiring actor or a desperate student, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust before grabbing the money and backing out of the room. I lay there, curled in a fetal ball, gasping for air, listening to the heavy footsteps of the stranger retreating down the stairs, leaving me alone with the true villain. Richard didn't come to hold me. He didn't offer me water. He simply walked over to the window and stared out at the night, clearly organizing the sentences in his head. "You know, for a moment there, you were magnificent," he said, his back to me, his reflection in the glass looking like a ghost. "The way your pupils dilated, that was pure gold. I think I finally know how to end chapter 12. He turned around, looking at me shivering on the bed, and shook his head with a small, patronizing smile. "But the fainting, that was a bit melodramatic. Darling, real victims don't faint. They fight. We'll have to work on your resilience." He walked out of the room, turning off the light, leaving me in the darkness with the lingering smell of the intruder's sweat and the crushing weight of the truth. I was married to a man who would watch me die just to get the adjectives right. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, a tomb-like quiet where I could hear the shattering of my own soul, piece by piece. As the adrenaline faded and the cold reality set in, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over, dissecting every moment, every word, every scratch of the pen. The fear that had paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot of hatred that settled in my stomach like a stone. A hatred so pure and focused that it clarified everything. He wanted a story about a victim. He wanted a tragedy. He wanted to control the narrative of my pain. Well, he was going to get a story. He was going to get an ending that no critic would see coming. Because as I lay there in the dark, I realized that the victim had died in that bed, and the woman who would rise with the sun was someone else entirely. The digital clock on the bathroom vanity blinked 4:03 a.m., a glowing red eye in the darkness, witnessing the moment I finally stopped being a character in Richard's tragedy and started writing my own ending. I stood before the mirror, the harsh, unforgiving glare of the LED vanity lights illuminating every pore, every tear track, and the thin, angry red line etched across my throat where the serrated blade had pressed just minutes ago. The silence in the house was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the air, broken only by the sound of Richard's rhythmic snoring from the master bedroom, a sound of such arrogant peacefulness that it made my hands tremble not with fear, but with a cold, crystallizing rage. I reached for the bottle of antiseptic, the smell of rubbing alcohol hitting my nose like a slap, sharp and sterile, and I dabbed it onto the cut, welcoming the sting because it grounded me. It reminded me that the pain was real. Even if the scenario that caused it was a fabrication, I didn't cry. Crying was for the woman who died in that bed an hour ago. Instead, I picked up my smartphone, wiped the lens with the edge of my silk robe, and began to document the evidence with the detached precision of a forensic pathologist. Click. Flash. Save. The camera captured the bruising forming on my wrists where the intruder had pinned me. Click. Flash. Save. It captured the terror that still lingered in the corners of my eyes, preserving the aftermath of Richard's creative process before my body could heal itself. I knew that in a court of law, these photos would just be pictures of a domestic incident, easily explained away by a charismatic husband as an accident or rough play, unless they were anchored by something stronger, something undeniable. I walked out of the bathroom, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, and knelt by the side of the bed where I had hidden my emergency go-bag months ago. A pitiful collection of cash and clothes that represented a fantasy of escape I never had the courage to execute. I pulled it out, staring at the zipper, and for a fleeting second, the urge to run was so powerful it nearly buckled my knees. The instinct to flee into the night, to drive until the gas ran out, to disappear into the anonymity of a roadside motel. But then I looked at the door to the bedroom where Richard slept, and I realized that running would only validate his narrative. He would tell the world I had a mental break, that I was unstable, and I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, haunted by the ghost of his reputation. No, I whispered to the empty hallway. I am not going to run. I am going to stay. I am going to stand my ground. And I am going to burn his kingdom to the ground while he is still inside it. I took the phone into the walk-in closet, burying myself among the rows of his expensive Italian suits, the smell of cedar and his cologne enveloping me. And I sat on the floor, surrounded by the costumes of the man he pretended to be. I dialed the first number, a number I had memorized 5 years ago. The private line of Detective Vance, the man who had pulled me out of that cellar when I was 16, the only man who knew the texture of my trauma as well as I did. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a gruff, sleep-heavy voice answered. Vance speaking. This better be good. And I closed my eyes, letting the sound of a protector anchor me. It's Elena, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the static. He did it. Vance. He hired someone to recreate the abduction. He held a knife to my throat, and I have the proof. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so thick I could hear the rustle of his sheets as he sat up. The immediate shift from sleep to high alert. Are you safe? Is he there? Do I need to roll units? I'm safe for now, I replied, my fingers tracing the hem of Richard's suit jacket. But I don't just want him arrested for assault. Vance, I want him destroyed. I want everyone to know that the great Richard Sterling is a fraud and a monster. I told him about the USB drive, about the emails to the actor, about the plagiarism of my therapy journals. And I heard Vance's breathing change, becoming heavy and rhythmic, the breathing of a predator who has just caught the scent of blood. I'm on my way, he said, his voice hard as granite. Don't let him leave. Don't let him destroy anything. I'll be there in 2 hours with a warrant. And Elena, this time, we finish it. I hung up, feeling a weight lift off my chest. The first pillar of Richard's destruction set firmly in place. The law was coming, and it wasn't coming to save me. It was coming to vindicate me. The second call was harder, more calculated. A strategic strike at the heart of Richard's ego, at the source of his power and his wealth. I dialed Clara, the editor-in-chief of the publishing house in New York, knowing that due to the time difference, she would already be in her office, nursing her first espresso and reviewing manuscripts. She answered on the second ring, her tone professional and brisk. Elena, Is everything all right? It's awfully early on the West Coast. Richard has finished the book. Clara, I said, injecting a note of frantic urgency into my voice, playing the role of the concerned wife one last time. But you need to see the raw files. The ones he tried to delete. Before you print a single page. What are you talking about? She asked, her pen stopping its scratching on the paper. Her editorial instincts pricking up at the scent of scandal. He didn't write it. Clara. I dropped the bomb with quiet satisfaction. He stole it. He stole it from my therapy journals. Word for word. The kidnapping. The abuse. It's not fiction. It's my medical record. And I have the side-by-side comparison ready to send to you. I heard the sharp intake of breath. The sound of a coffee cup being set down a little too hard on a glass desk. Elena. That is a very serious accusation. That would be the end of his career. The lawsuits alone would bankrupt the imprint. I'm emailing you the proof right now, I said, hitting send on the file I had prepared earlier. And Clara. He hired a man to break into our house tonight to inspire the ending. The police are on their way. There was a long silence. The silence of a businesswoman calculating the risk, weighing the liability. And then she spoke, her voice cold and devoid of friendship. I'm getting on the next flight. Keep him there. If this is true, I will personally shred his contract. I ended the call, smiling into the darkness of the closet, imagining the chaos erupting in a high-rise office in Manhattan. The panic of the PR team. The crumbling of the pedestal Richard stood on. He thought he was a god of literature, untouchable and brilliant. But he was about to learn that gods can be killed by the very worshippers they betray. The final call was the most practical, the one that ensured he would have nowhere to run, no resources to fight the war I had just declared. I logged into our bank's automated fraud detection system, navigating the menus with trembling fingers, my eyes scanning the recent transaction history on the glowing screen. There it was, a withdrawal of $5,000 in cash yesterday afternoon, labeled miscellaneous. The payment for the actor, the price of my terror. I navigated to the joint account settings, the accounts that held the millions he had made from my pain, and I selected the option to report suspicious activity, to freeze all assets pending an investigation. Please confirm that you suspect fraudulent access by a secondary party, the robotic voice prompted, and I pressed yes without a moment's hesitation, effectively locking him out of his own fortune. Your accounts have been frozen, the voice confirmed. No withdrawals or transfers will be permitted until you visit a branch in person with identification. It was done. The trap was snapped shut. The net was drawn tight, and he was still sleeping, blissfully unaware that he was now a pauper, a fraud, and a soon-to-be prisoner. I stood up, my legs stiff but strong, and walked out of the closet, leaving the smell of his lies behind me, and moved to the full-length mirror in the bedroom. I stripped off the silk robe, the fabric pooling at my feet like a shed skin, and I dressed myself in my armor, a structured red dress that he always hated because he said it was too aggressive. I applied my makeup with the precision of war paint, covering the paleness of my shock but leaving the bruises on my neck exposed. A violent purple necklace that demanded attention. I looked at myself one last time, meeting the eyes of the stranger in the glass. The woman who had made the calls. The woman who had set the world on fire while everyone else slept. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, turning from bruised purple to a pale, sickly gray. The dawn of the day that would change everything. I could hear the birds starting to sing, oblivious to the violence of the night. And I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The calm of the eye of the storm. I walked out of the bedroom, my heels clicking softly on the floor. a rhythmic countdown to the confrontation, and I descended the stairs to the kitchen. The heart of the house. I didn't need a gun. I didn't need a knife. I had the truth. And I had the law. And I had the patience of a woman who has waited 5 years to speak. I reached for the flour, the sugar, the blackberries, and I began to bake, transforming the kitchen into a stage, filling the air with the scent of memory, waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of Richard Sterling. The kitchen is filled with the thick, cloying scent of baked blackberries and caramelized sugar, a heavy perfume that hangs in the air like a sweet, suffocating fog, masking the sterile smell of the cleaning products I used to scrub the floor earlier. I stand by the island, my spine rigid and straight as a steel rod, wearing the blood-red dress that clings to my body like a second skin. A deliberate visual scream against the monochromatic gray of Richard's designer kitchen. I hear his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and unhurried, the confident gait of a man who believes he is the master of his domain, the king of a castle built on the bones of my sanity. He enters the room, tying the sash of his silk robe, his hair perfectly tousled, his face flushed with the lingering adrenaline of his creative breakthrough last night. And he stops when he sees me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before settling into a smug, satisfied smirk. He mistakes the dress for a costume of submission. He mistakes the pie for a peace offering. And he mistakes my silence for the quiet reverence of a muse who has finally accepted her role in his grand design. He walks toward me, bypassing the coffee machine to come straight to where I am standing, and he reaches out a hand to touch the bruise on my neck, his fingers cool and dry against my feverish skin. I do not flinch. I do not pull away. I simply hold his gaze with a terrifying stillness, letting him inspect his handiwork as if he were checking the ripeness of a piece of fruit at the market. A little too purple. Don't you think he muses? Tilting his head critically. Next time, tell the actor to be gentler. We want haunting. Elena, not battered wife. It needs to look artistic on the book jacket, not criminal. The audacity of his words, the casual way he critiques the violence he orchestrated, sends a jolt of nausea through me. But I push it down, converting the bile into fuel, letting it harden my resolve like concrete setting in the sun. I made breakfast, I say, my voice devoid of tremor, smooth and flat. Blackberry pie, just like you used to say you wanted to try. A celebration of the final chapter. Richard chuckles, a low, throaty sound of pure self-satisfaction. And he pulls out a stool, sitting down with the air of a monarch taking his throne, spreading his napkin across his lap with a flourish. You see, I knew you'd understand eventually, he says, picking up his fork. Pain is just a tool, Elena, a necessary instrument to excavate the truth. And look at you now. You're not broken. You're vibrant. You're practically glowing with intensity. I pick up the silver cake server, the metal gleaming under the recessed lights, and I slice into the pie, the crust shattering with a sharp, crisp sound that echoes in the silent room. I place a large, steaming wedge onto a bone china plate, the dark filling bleeding out onto the white porcelain like a fresh wound, and I slide it in front of him, watching his pupils dilate as the smell hits him. He hesitates for a fraction of a second, a primal instinct warning him that something is wrong, that the scent is too familiar, too tied to the darkness of the cellar. But his arrogance overrides his survival instinct, and he takes the first bite. He chews slowly, the sweetness of the berries mixing with the bitterness of the memory, and I watch his throat work as he swallows, forcing down the symbol of my trauma, consuming the very thing he has exploited for profit. It's rich, he says, reaching for his coffee, his eyes darting to my face, looking for a sign of weakness, a sign of the trembling victim he expects, but finding only a mirror of cold, hard judgment. "I've been thinking about the press tour," he continues, trying to fill the unnerving silence. "Talking faster now. We'll do Oprah. Maybe a joint interview. The couple, who bleeds for art. The narrative writes itself. We are going to make millions on this one. Elena. Absolute millions. He is building castles in the air, planning a future on a foundation that has already turned to quicksand, completely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts are frozen and his reputation is about to be shredded. I pour myself a cup of black coffee, the steam rising between us like a veil, and I take a sip, the bitter liquid grounding me, sharpening my senses for the impact that is seconds away. "You're awfully quiet, my love," he says, wiping a crumb from his lip, his smile faltering slightly at the edges, finally sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The static charge of a storm about to break. Usually you'd be crying by now, or begging me to promise never to do it again. He laughs nervously, pushing the half-eaten pie away. But this stoicism, it's new. "Have you been taking extra medication?" I set my cup down with a deliberate, soft click, leaning forward until my face is inches from his, letting him see the fire burning in my eyes, the fire that has burned away the fear. "I'm not medicated, Richard," I whisper, my voice soft but cutting, like a razor blade wrapped in silk. "I'm just waiting for the audience to arrive, because a performance this good deserves witnesses." He opens his mouth to ask what I mean, his brow furrowing in confusion. But before he can speak, the silence is shattered by the sharp, authoritative chime of the doorbell, ringing once, twice, 3 times, signaling the end of his world. The echo of the doorbell hangs in the vast, open space of the kitchen, like the reverberation of a judge's gavel, slicing through the tension and momentarily stunning Richard into a frozen tableau of annoyance. He blinks, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, the piece of blackberry pie trembling slightly on the tines. And then his face contorts into a mask of petulant irritation, the look of a genius whose soliloquy has been rudely interrupted by the banal realities of the outside world. "Who the hell is disturbing us at this hour?" he snaps, dropping the fork onto the china with a clatter that sounds like a gunshot in the silence. "I explicitly told the agency no deliveries before noon. I cannot create with these constant interruptions." He pushes his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the marble floor, and stands up, tightening the sash of his silk robe with an aggressive jerk, preparing to march to the door and unleash his famous temper on whatever poor soul is standing on the porch. "Sit down, Richard," I say, my voice low and devoid of any emotion. A simple, declarative command that stops him dead in his tracks, causing him to turn and look at me with genuine confusion. As if the coffee machine had suddenly started speaking Latin, he stares at me, his mouth slightly open, processing the sheer audacity of the order, trying to reconcile the trembling victim of last night with the woman currently sipping black coffee with the poise of a queen. "Excuse me," he laughs nervously, a short, barking sound that lacks his usual confidence. "Did you just tell me to sit down in my own house, Elena?" "Darling, I think the shock has scrambled your priorities." He takes a step toward the hallway, dismissing my rebellion as a symptom of hysteria. But I do not move. I do not blink. I simply turn my head toward the foyer and raise my voice just enough to carry. I said, "Sit down. I will get the door. They are here for me. Not you." The certainty in my tone, the absolute lack of hesitation, finally pierces his arrogance, planting a seed of doubt that roots him to the spot. his eyes darting from me to the front door. Sensing a trap but unable to see the mechanism, I stand up, smoothing the red fabric of my dress over my hips, and walk past him, close enough that he can smell the scent of my perfume mixed with the antiseptic on my neck, and I head toward the entrance. Leaving him standing in the kitchen like a lost child, I reach the heavy oak door, my hand closing over the cool brass handle, and I take a deep breath, centering myself, inhaling the freedom that is waiting on the other side of the wood. I pull the door open, revealing the gray morning light and the two figures standing on the porch like sentinels of judgment. Their grim expressions a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of our suburban lawn. Detective Vance stands in front, his trench coat rumpled, his face set in lines of hard experience, his eyes immediately finding the bruise on my neck and narrowing with a dangerous, protective heat. Behind him is Clara, clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest as if it were a shield, her face pale and drawn, the betrayal of her star author clearly weighing on her like a physical burden. "Good morning," I say softly, stepping back to allow them entry. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I apologize for the early hour, but time was of the essence." Vance nods, stepping over the threshold with the heavy, authoritative tread of a man who is entering a crime scene, not a social gathering. And Clara follows, refusing to look at the luxury of the foyer, her eyes fixed on the floor as if ashamed to be part of the deception that built this house. Richard appears in the archway, connecting the hall to the kitchen, his face draining of color as he recognizes the guests, his skin turning the shade of old parchment. "Detective Vance Clara," he stammers, his voice cracking, the smooth baritone of the literary giant fracturing into the high pitch of a caught schoolboy. What is this? Is something wrong? Has something happened to the manuscript?" He tries to compose himself, forcing a smile that looks like a rictus of pain, smoothing his hair, desperately trying to reassemble the persona of the charming, successful husband. "Come in. Come in. Please." He gestures vaguely, his hands shaking. I wasn't expecting company. Or I would have. I would have dressed. "Elena, why didn't you tell me we had a meeting?" He is gaslighting himself now, trying to rewrite the reality unfolding before him into a misunderstanding. A surprise party. Anything other than the execution it is. Vance walks right past him, ignoring the outstretched hand, his shoulder brushing against Richard's robe with deliberate disrespect, and heads straight for the kitchen table. While Clara finally looks up, her eyes wet with tears of rage, and whispers, "We need to talk." "Richard." I lead them into the kitchen, the space that Richard designed to be his stage, and I gesture for them to take the seats opposite him, positioning myself at the head of the table, the spot he usually occupies. "Please, sit," I say, pouring 2 fresh cups of coffee, my movements fluid and gracious, playing the role of the hostess in a funeral for his career. Richard sinks back into his chair, looking small and diminished in his robe, surrounded by fully dressed professionals who are looking at him not with admiration, but with the clinical scrutiny of entomologists examining a poisonous insect. "I don't understand," Richard says, looking from Vance's stony face to Clara's trembling hands. "Vance, if this is about the incident last night, I can explain. It was a research exercise, a consensual role play for the book." He looks at me for confirmation, his eyes pleading for me to back up his lie, to be the good wife one last time. "Tell them." "Elena," he urges, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. "Tell them it was for the art." "It was for the art," I repeat, my voice flat, echoing his words but stripping them of all power. but the art was stolen. And the consent was coerced. I placed the silver coffee pot on the trivet, the metallic clink signaling the start of the proceedings. And I look at Clara. Show him. I say simply. Clara opens the manila envelope, her hands shaking as she pulls out 2 stacks of paper. One is Richard's latest manuscript, freshly printed on bright white paper, and the other is a photocopy of my old, battered therapy journal, the handwriting jagged and stained with tears. She slides them across the marble surface, the papers fanning out until they overlap, revealing the undeniable truth, entire paragraphs lifted verbatim. The descriptions of my torture, the dialogue of my captors, the intimate, humiliating details of my PTSD. Richard stares at the papers, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The evidence of his theft lying between a plate of half-eaten pie and a cup of cooling coffee. You stole her trauma. Richard, Clara says, her voice breaking. You didn't write fiction. You transcribed her pain and sold it as your own genius. The room is silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and Richard's ragged breathing, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. He looks up at me, his eyes wide with betrayal, as if I am the one who has wronged him by exposing his crime. I gave you a life, he hisses, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, abandoning the charade of the nice guy. I took you out of the gutter. I gave you this house, these clothes. I made you relevant. Vance leans forward, placing his elbows on the table, invading Richard's personal space. And then you hired a thug to hold a knife to her throat because you ran out of material. He growls, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt and laying them on the table with a heavy, metallic thud. That's not making her relevant. Mr. Sterling. That's conspiracy to commit assault. And in this state, that's a felony that carries a mandatory minimum. Richard recoils from the handcuffs as if they are a venomous snake, pressing his back into the chair, realizing finally that the walls are closing in, and there is no exit door in this plot. The kitchen is silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged, panicked breathing of the man who used to own this room. And I reach out to pick up the worn, red leather journal that Clara placed on the table. It feels heavy in my hands, not because of its physical weight, but because it holds the dense, radioactive mass of my suffering, the raw, unpolished nightmares that I scribbled down in the dark to keep myself from falling apart. I open it to a page marked with a sticky note, the paper crinkled where my tears had once fallen, and I begin to read aloud, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a scalpel through necrotic tissue. The cellar smelled of damp earth and rotting blackberries. I read, and every time he came down the stairs, I counted the footsteps, praying that today would be the day he forgot to lock the door. I pause, letting the words hang in the air. And then I pick up Richard's pristine, freshly printed manuscript. Flipping to page 42. The basement reeked of wet soil and decaying fruit. I read from his text, looking directly into his eyes, and she lay there counting his treads, a desperate prayer on her lips that the lock would remain unfastened. Richard flinches as if I have struck him, sinking deeper into his chair, his face a mask of crumbling arrogance, realizing that the juxtaposition of the 2 texts is not just a similarity, it is a forensic match of theft. You didn't just borrow a theme, Richard, I say, closing both books with a soft, final thud. You cannibalized my soul. You took the worst moments of my life, the moments that still wake me up screaming, and you turned them into a product to buy your Italian suits and your vintage scotch. Clara lets out a small, choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand, looking at Richard with a mixture of horror and professional disgust, seeing him now not as a literary prodigy, but as a parasite. I can explain. Richard stammers, his hands fluttering uselessly in the air. It's called artistic license. Clara. I was honoring her story. I was giving it a voice that she didn't have the talent to express herself. It is a pathetic defense. The gasping breath of a drowning man. And it only serves to harden the look of contempt on Vance's face. Talent isn't the issue here, Mr. Sterling, Vance says, his voice grinding like gravel. Consent is the issue. And frankly, plagiarism is the least of your problems right now. I reach into the pocket of my dress and pull out my smartphone. The screen glowing with the interface of the voice memo app. The recording from last night queued up and ready to play. He says he was honoring me. I say to Vance, placing the phone in the center of the table. Let's hear how he honors his wife when he thinks no one is watching. I press play, and the kitchen is suddenly filled with the tinny, digitized sounds of violence, the crash of glass. My terrified screams, the heavy breathing of the actor, and then, cutting through it all, Richard's calm, directorial voice. Tilt her chin up more. The recording plays. I need to see the fear. Elena, stop crying and give me something usable. The silence that follows the recording is absolute. A vacuum where Richard's reputation has been completely obliterated, leaving only the naked, ugly truth of his sadism. Richard leaps to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the marble floor, his face twisted into a snarl of desperation. The cornered rat finally showing its teeth. She's crazy, he screams, pointing a shaking finger at me. Spit flying from his lips. She staged this. She hired the actor. She's been off her meds for weeks. Clara. You know she has a history of delusions. He looks frantically from Clara to Vance, begging them to buy into the narrative he has carefully cultivated for years. The story of the unstable wife and the saintly husband. Look at her, he yells, gesturing to my red dress, to the pie, to the calm expression on my face. Does this look like a victim? She's enjoying this. She's a psychopath. Clara stands up slowly, gathering the manuscripts into her arms, and looks at him with eyes that are colder than ice. The only psychopath in this room. Richard, she says, her voice trembling with suppressed rage, is the man who monetized his wife's torture. Consider your contract terminated. Effective immediately. Vance moves with the sudden, blurring speed of a striking cobra, stepping around the table and grabbing Richard's wrist, twisting it behind his back with a practiced, efficient motion that elicits a yelp of pain. Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, domestic abuse, and solicitation of a felony. Vance recites, the Miranda rights flowing from his tongue like a prayer of retribution, as the metallic click-click of the handcuffs signals the end of Richard's reign. Richard struggles, thrashing against the hold, his robe gaping open to reveal his pale, sweating chest, stripping him of the last shreds of his dignity. You can't do this, he shouts. Do you know who I am? I am a New York Times bestseller. I am a cultural icon. Vance shoves him forward, propelling him toward the hallway. Right now, you're just a perp, and you have the right to remain silent, which I suggest you start using. As they drag him toward the front door, Richard twists his head back, his eyes locking onto mine, wild and full of a terrifying mixture of hatred and pleading. Elena, Elena. Tell them to stop, he begs, his voice cracking. I love you. I did it for us. Who will take care of you? You're nothing without me. I do not stand up. I do not look away. I simply pick up my fork and take a small, deliberate bite of the blackberry pie, the taste of sweet fruit and buttery crust filling my mouth. I chew slowly, savoring the flavor. letting him see that his words no longer have the power to hurt me, that his absence is not a void, but a liberation. The front door slams shut with a heavy, final thud, cutting off his screams, and the house settles back into silence. But this time, it is not the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a blank page, waiting to be written. The wail of the police siren fades into the distance, a mournful, dying sound that is swallowed by the heavy silence of the suburbs, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing cavern of the kitchen. I sit there for a long time, the fork resting loosely in my fingers, staring at the crumbs of the blackberry pie scattered on the white china like debris from a battlefield. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the morning, that had kept my spine straight and my voice steady, begins to drain away, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion that seeps into my marrow. I take one last bite of the pie, the sweetness now mingled with the salt of my own tears, which are finally falling, not with the hysterical sobbing of a victim, but with the quiet, steady flow of a dam breaking after years of pressure. I cry for the girl who was abducted at 16. I cry for the woman who was exploited at 25. And I cry for the years of silence that I can never get back, letting the grief wash over me, cleansing the wound so that it can finally begin to heal. The house feels different now, the air no longer charged with the static of Richard's moods, but empty, neutral. A space that is waiting to be defined not by his ego, but by my existence. I push the plate away and stand up, my legs feeling heavy but solid, and I walk out of the kitchen, leaving the mess for later, leaving the remnants of the Judgment Day breakfast to stale on the counter. I climb the floating staircase, my hand trailing along the cold metal railing, and I enter the master bedroom, the room that was once a stage for his manipulation and my terror. I walk straight to the vanity mirror, looking at the stranger in the red dress, the warrior woman I created to survive the morning. And I pick up a cotton pad, soaking it in micellar water. I scrub at my face, wiping away the foundation, the contour, the lipstick, peeling away the mask until my skin is raw and red, until the pale, tired face of Elena looks back at me. I unzip the red dress, letting it fall to the floor in a pool of crimson fabric, stepping out of it as if I am shedding a snake's skin, leaving behind the symbol of my vengeance. I put on a pair of old, soft sweatpants and a t-shirt, clothes that are unglamorous and comfortable, clothes that Richard hated because they weren't photogenic. And for the first time in years, I breathe easily, my lungs expanding fully against ribs that are no longer constricted by fear. The next few days are a blur of movement and boxes, a frenzy of purging that feels less like cleaning and more like an exorcism. As I move through the house, erasing the traces of the man who tried to erase me, I start in his study, the inner sanctum of his lies, and I pull heavy-duty black trash bags from the roll, snapping them open with a sound that is sharp and satisfying. I sweep his awards off the shelves, the crystal trophies shattering as they hit the bottom of the bag. Meaningless trinkets given to a thief by a deceived public. I take his expensive fountain pens, his imported Italian stationery, the framed covers of his bestsellers, and I throw them all away, refusing to donate them, refusing to let his energy circulate back into the world. I find the stash of his cologne in the bathroom, the scent that used to trigger my panic attacks, and I pour every bottle down the sink, watching the amber liquid swirl away, the smell briefly filling the room before being overpowered by the clean, sharp scent of bleach. The house begins to echo differently as I clear out his clutter, the spaces opening up, the shadows retreating, as if the architecture itself is sighing in relief now that the monster has been evicted. 6 months pass, and the seasons change outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The gray gloom of that terrible morning replaced by the vibrant, insistent green of spring. I have not sold the house. Not yet. Because I realized that running away from it would be giving him the final victory. So instead, I have reclaimed it, repainting the walls in colors he would have detested, filling the rooms with plants and soft, mismatched furniture. I sit in the sunroom, which used to be his meditation space where I was forbidden to enter, and I look at the laptop screen resting on my knees, the cursor blinking with a steady, inviting rhythm. It is a simple machine, not the pretentious vintage typewriter he used. And on the screen, there is no tale of murder, no sensationalized violence, just a story about a girl who survived. I type slowly, searching for the words, but this time they are my words, not dictated by fear, not filtered through the male gaze, but raw and imperfect and entirely mine. I am writing under my own name, Elena Vance, my maiden name, which I legally restored last week, and the story is not a thriller. It is a memoir of recovery, a map for other women who are currently lost in the dark cellars of their own lives. A car pulls up the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel, and I tense for a fraction of a second, an old reflex that is fading but not gone. Before I recognize the logo of the mail carrier, he drops a bundle of letters in the box and drives away, and I walk out to retrieve them, flipping through the bills and catalogs until I freeze at the sight of a stark white envelope with the return address of the state correctional facility. It is from him, or perhaps from his lawyer, a final attempt to reach out, to manipulate, to beg, or to explain. His handwriting on the front scrawled and desperate. I stand there in the driveway, the sun warming my shoulders, holding the voice of my abuser in my hand, and I feel nothing. No fear, no anger, no curiosity, just a profound indifference, a realization that he is no longer a monster under my bed, but just a sad, small man in a cage of his own making. I do not open the letter. I do not wonder what lies it contains. Instead, I walk to the fire pit in the garden, strike a match, and hold the flame to the corner of the envelope, watching the paper curl and blacken, the words turning to ash and floating away on the wind. Lighter than air, I sit down on the garden bench, the stone warm against my legs, and I look out at the blackberry bushes that grow wild along the fence line. The very bushes that once haunted my nightmares. They are blooming now. Small, white flowers that promise a harvest in the summer. And I realize that the scent no longer makes me nauseous. It smells like nature. It smells like growth. It smells like life persisting despite everything. I have a cup of tea in my hand. Earl Grey. Hot and fragrant. And I take a sip, closing my eyes and listening to the birds singing in the oak trees, a sound that is no longer interrupted by his criticism or his demands. I am alone. Yes, but I am not lonely. I are filled with the expansive, quiet joy of ownership, ownership of my home, ownership of my past, and most importantly, ownership of my future. I open my eyes and look at the blank page of the sky, realizing that for the first time in my life, I don't know what happens in the next chapter. And that is the most beautiful ending I could have ever written.